It begins, as so many of my recollections do, not with the clang of discovery, but with the quiet irritation of something misplaced. I had left a glass half full, the rim already beginning to fog from the late September damp on the small oak table beside my armchair. When I returned to it after a call that had unsettled more than it explained, I found the glass moved, shifted by no more than an inch. It should have been nothing, and perhaps it was. But the eye that has spent its life noting smudged pencil strokes on exam papers and forgotten Latin accents on gravestones cannot fail to notice the incremental trespasses of life. Oxford at that hour was murmuring under rain, the kind of rain that finds its way into mortar and book spines, that makes the very air taste of stone and ink. I had returned from a minor consultation at Keble, where a porter had been foolish enough to believe that missing silver from the senior common room could be explained by nothing more than carelessness. The matter had irritated me because it was too simple, and simplicity in Oxford is almost always an illusion. The phone call came just as I had removed my shoes, and the voice at the other end, low, hesitant, strained, belonged to a young constable from Carfax Station. He asked if I might call upon a lodging house on Holywell Street, where a woman had been found sitting by her window, eyes open, the world already departed from her. The death was, on the face of it, natural. Age, frailty, the heart's final capitulation. But the constable had felt uneasy, and unease, when genuine, is seldom wrong. I told him I would come at once, though in truth I lingered long enough to note the glass on my table. Whisky, the peat and honey kind, left untouched for half an hour. Its displacement meant little. Still it lodged in me like a crossword clue not yet solved, trivial perhaps, but never irrelevant. Holywell Street was a narrow mouth of wet stone, the lamps blurred in the rain. The lodging house was one of those tall, tired buildings that sagged under the weight of its own history. A faint smell of boiled cabbage hovered in the stairwell. The constable, a nervous fellow with hair plastered dark against his forehead, led me to the second floor. She was seated in a wooden chair by the window, the glass misted with condensation from the room's weak fire. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. There was no fear, no struggle, only the pale, thinned serenity of someone who had been waiting for something that never came. The doctor, who had been summoned, gave me the expected line of heart failure, nothing untoward, poor health for years. But the constable shifted from foot to foot, unwilling to leave it there. He muttered something about a visitor who had called earlier, a man not recognized by any of the other tenants, a man who had stayed no more than 10 minutes and then left without a word. The room itself was almost bare. A bed pressed against the wall, a chest of drawers with a missing handle, a few photographs turned face down on the mantelpiece. What caught me, though, was the glass on the table beside her chair. Half full. Whisky again, or perhaps sherry, though the scent was faint. A glass that had been placed with care, as though waiting to be lifted and tasted, yet remained untouched. It was nothing, or it was everything. A life ended before the final sip. A gesture incomplete. I asked the constable to describe the visitor, and he struggled, as all witnesses do when pressed. Medium height, dark coat, a voice not local, though he could not place it. The details were smoke. But he did remember one thing with certainty: the man had carried a book in his hand, an old volume with a marbled cover. He had not opened it. He had only held it, like a talisman. The deduction, if such it could be called, arrived not in a flash, but as a slow tightening of threads. A book carried but not read, a glass poured but not touched, a woman who had turned her photographs face down, as if unwilling to meet the eyes of her own past. These were gestures, not accidents, signs of preparation, or of farewell. Back at my room, I thought again of my own glass, shifted on the oak table. Had I nudged it myself in passing? Almost certainly. Yet the unease remained, and in that unease I recognized the same pulse that had driven the constable to call me. Something small, something off-key, demanding to be heard. I poured another measure and sat by the window, listening to the rain strike against the panes. Oxford's bells tolled distantly, blurred by the weather, each strike a reminder of time's indifferent passage. I thought of her as the woman in the wooden chair and the man with the book who had sat with her for 10 minutes only. 10 minutes, then silence. It was not grief I felt, not yet. Grief belongs to those who have lost something tangible. What I felt was the pressure of an unanswered question. Why had the glass been left waiting? Why had she not touched it? The city, in its infinite indifference, would close over her death as it had over countless others. But I could not. My nature, for better or worse, is to linger over the displaced, the overlooked, the incomplete. That night, long after the constable's call had ended, long after the rain had softened into mist, I set the untouched glass beside me on my desk. It remained there as I turned the first pages of the case, as yet unwritten, but already certain to disturb more than it resolved. And somewhere, in a lodging house on Holywell Street, another glass still stood waiting, a silent witness to a life concluded before its final gesture. It came to me first, not through any official channel, nor by the usual paperwork that shuffles from desk to desk until it arrives late and irrelevant, but in the thin columns of the Oxford Mail. They had chosen a single paragraph buried on page 5, between a report of rising bus fares and the rearranged fixtures of the local football league. A woman was found dead at her residence on Holywell Street. No suspicious circumstances. Her name offered without embellishment, Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb, aged 68. It is strange how death, which to those closest feels volcanic, appears to the public as nothing more than a brief notation, barely longer than the announcement of a whistle drive or a lecture on medieval manuscripts. I read the words at my kitchen table, the paper stained with coffee rings, and felt a faint irritation that someone had decided her departure could be so quickly summarized. But irritation was not all. My mind tugged again at what the constable had told me, that the photographs in her room had been turned face down. Such gestures are not for the dead. They are for the living, unwilling to meet remembered eyes. I folded the paper and set it beside my crossword, half solved, the corner where I had been struggling over a 5-letter word meaning oblivion. I had written Lethe but rubbed it out again. It felt too obvious, too easy. Death, I knew, was never that. Later that morning I visited Carfax Station. The constable who had first summoned me, Chandler, greeted me with that mixture of pride and nervousness young officers often have when they believe they have noticed something their seniors have overlooked. He told me, with evident relief, that the pathologist had confirmed the cause as heart failure. No marks of violence, no foreign substances detected. An old woman had died as old women must. I asked him gently if he still felt uneasy. He nodded, almost ashamed. There was something in her eyes, sir, he murmured. They weren't closed, as though she were waiting for someone to finish a sentence. It was a peculiar description, but not without resonance. We often die with words unspoken, I thought. Words, we believe, will be uttered tomorrow or the day after, until the body disagrees. Still his observation lingered. I asked about the visitor with the marbled book. Chandler confessed that no other tenant had seen him clearly, though one had heard footsteps on the stairs, heavier than those of the lodgers who usually came and went. The description of a man of middling height, dark coat, not local, was as shapeless as smoke. Yet the book remained vivid in Chandler's mind. He was quite sure of it, the kind of certainty that doesn't emerge from invention. Oxford, of course, is crowded with books. They circulate like blood. Marbled covers are not unusual in this city, but a book carried and not opened, as I had considered the night before, was another matter. I requested the key to her room. The landlady hesitated, worried about propriety, but at last handed it over with the shrug of someone who believes all mysteries can be explained with enough time and gossip. Inside, the room smelled faintly of lavender and coal dust. The glass still sat by the chair, the liquid in it flat now like a mirror left too long. On the mantelpiece I studied the photographs she had placed face down. Against instinct, I turned one upright. A man in military uniform. A younger Eleanor beside him, her eyes shadowed yet resolute. Another, a boy at what looked like a grammar school prize day. And a third, indistinct, water-damaged, of two figures outside a church door. I set them back as they had been, though not without the sense that she had tried to close a chapter before its last page was read. On her desk I found a small stack of letters tied with ribbon. Most were innocuous subscriptions, reminders, polite correspondence from charities. Yet one envelope, placed apart, bore no stamp, no address. Only her name, written in a hand that seemed hurried, uneven. Inside, nothing but a single sheet on which a line had been written, "I shall come as promised." No signature, no date. The deduction, if it could be dignified with that word, was that the visitor with the book had announced himself in writing before arriving. She had expected him, perhaps even invited him. And yet, whatever he brought, words, memories, warnings, had left her untouched glass waiting. I slipped the letter back into its envelope and returned it to its place. I have never liked removing things from the scenes of death. Too often they tell us more in their stillness than they ever will under fluorescent lamps at the station. When I left Holywell Street, the bells of St. Cross were tolling the noon hour, their sound flat and tired in the damp. I stood under the eaves, the rain running in thin rivulets down the guttering, and considered what had truly been announced. The newspaper had declared a death, neatly boxed and measured in ink. The letter on her desk had promised a visit, a fulfillment. Between those two announcements, one public, one private, lay a silence in which she had folded her photographs, left her glass untouched, and waited with eyes open for something unfinished. I returned to my room that evening, poured a measure from the same bottle, and stared at my crossword once more. The clue, 5 letters meaning oblivion. I had written Lethe, then rubbed it out. This time I wrote it again. The word sat there, stubborn and incomplete, as though waiting for a companion clue to bring it into sense, and so the death was announced. But in Oxford I have learned, an announcement is never the end. It is merely the prelude to a question. I have always found that colleges, even in daylight, possess their own nocturnes. The stones hum with secrecy, the staircases coil upward like questions never asked. And yet the sun insists upon washing it all in an innocence they do not deserve. It was into one such innocence I walked that morning, invited by nothing more than instinct and the faint thread of Eleanor Whitcomb's past. The clue had been almost incidental to the photograph of a man in military uniform. Behind him, just discernible through the faded tones, was the arch of a familiar gateway. Not Holywell Street, not any parish church. No, it was the gate of St. Saviour's College, where the ivy falls in uneven patches and the gargoyles wear perpetual grimaces of contempt. I told myself I might be mistaken, but the memory of stone is as reliable as any file in the archives. So I went, without an invitation, and found myself beneath its cloisters, the rain still glistening on flagstones worn by centuries of nervous feet. A porter met me, one of those ageless men who seem carved from the same granite as their lodge. He was courteous in the wary way of Oxford servants who understand that knowledge is both currency and danger. Yes, he remembered Mrs. Whitcomb. Her husband had been a fellow here once, long ago, before the war had carried him off to Belgium and returned him to English soil with no breath in him. The widow had visited from time to time, he added, as if she were visiting not bricks, but ghosts. The college was hushed, the students dispersed for the vacation, and I walked its corridors with only my own footsteps as company. In the library the air was covered with dust and vellum. I asked the librarian if she recalled Mrs. Whitcomb's son, the boy in the prize day photograph. She looked at me with mild suspicion, but nodded, bright, promising, though unsettled. He had read classics, struggled with Greek irregular verbs, yet excelled in history. He had left Oxford abruptly, she thought, after some scandal whispered but never recorded. Scandal is always more instructive for its evasions than its facts. I asked what sort of scandal, but she shook her head. The college, she murmured, had a way of smoothing over disturbances. She said it in the tone of someone who had learned to look away from cracks in the stone. I left the library unsettled, not by what I had been told, but by what had been omitted. In the quad the rain had ceased, and a pale sun revealed the shadow of the tower, stretching long across the grass. A college's shadow, I thought, is often longer than its reputation. It was then that I remembered the envelope I had seen on Eleanor's desk, the hurried script promising, "I shall come, as promised." The words were plain enough, yet curiously formal, almost liturgical. Not a son's note, not a friend's, but something written under obligation. I wondered whether the sender had some tie to this place, some link to a history the college preferred not to recall. As I lingered in the quad, I watched a figure cross briskly from one staircase to another. An elderly don stooped, papers clutched under his arm. His gaze flicked to me and away again. But in that flicker I recognized more than surprise. There was recognition, though he could not place me. It was the look of someone remembering another face altogether. Later, when I stopped him with a few mild questions, he admitted that he had once known Eleanor's husband. A fine man, he said quickly, though his eyes betrayed discomfort. I asked about the son. He hesitated, shuffled his papers, and confessed that the young man had left under what he termed unfortunate circumstances. He would not be drawn further. Back in my room that evening, I poured a measure and stared at the crossword again. 4 across, a clue that read "Scholar's Concealment." 7 letters. I thought at once of the college and its evasions. I wrote a cloister. It fitted, and yet it did not. Cloisters conceal, yes, but they also expose, framing silence within stone. My deduction, if it was one, lay only in the recognition that every shadow is cast by something solid, even if it resists inspection. Eleanor's life had stretched towards St. Saviour's, her husband's ghost still lodged there, her son's shame half buried in its archives, and now a visitor with a marbled book had stepped from that same shadow to sit with her for 10 minutes before her heart had ceased. Oxford does not forget. It simply turns photographs face down, waiting for someone to turn them upright again. And so I set my glass beside me, the whiskey catching the lamplight like memory itself, and thought of the college's shadow stretching farther than the eye could measure. Somewhere within it walked a man carrying a book, a man who had come as promised. It was never the official reports or the grand statements that carried weight with me, but the fragments that slipped through ordinary voices, fragments overheard in corridors, spoken carelessly on stairwells, murmured in the quiet exchanges of those who believed themselves unobserved. And in this case it was women in passing, who provided me with more substance than any file could hope to contain. Eleanor Whitcomb had lived quietly, almost invisibly, and yet invisibility is itself a kind of presence. When I asked about her at the grocer's near Holywell, the girl behind the counter recalled her at once, always precise in her purchases, never more than she required. A single apple, not a pound, a half loaf, never the whole. The girl spoke with the pity of youth, unable to imagine a life measured in such small transactions. I found myself reflecting that such restraint often conceals a past where abundance once betrayed. Another voice reached me through the laundress, who remembered Eleanor sending her linen irregularly, as though domestic order had been abandoned to the whims of memory. Once, she confided, a handkerchief arrived stained with ink. The woman had apologized in her neat, formal way, saying it was from old letters she had been reading. The laundress added, with the relish of one who savours curiosity, that the letters had smelled faintly of mould, as though brought from a long-neglected trunk. Women in passing, yet together they sketched a life folded in upon itself, a widow who returned again and again to relics rather than reach toward the present. It was in a tea-room off Broad Street that I heard the most curious remark. A waitress, after some persuasion, remembered seeing Eleanor some months earlier with another woman. She could not describe her companion clearly, middle-aged, reserved, with a scarf wound tightly at the throat, but she remembered that Eleanor had seemed anxious, glancing often at the door as if expecting someone else. When I asked if a book had been visible, she frowned and shook her head. "Only a small parcel," she said, neatly wrapped in brown paper. A parcel, a scarf, a woman half remembered. Such details are seldom decisive, yet they stay with me like unfilled squares in a crossword. Back in my room, I considered what linked them to the apple, the ink-stained handkerchief, and the brown paper parcel. Small things, diminished things. Eleanor had been parceling her life into fragments, and perhaps the visitor with the marbled book had been the final fragment she had expected, the last piece of an unfinished pattern. That evening I unfolded the day's crossword. One clue, 10 down, lingered unresolved. A woman remembered 4 letters briefly. The obvious solution was name, though it felt unsatisfactory, too bald. I wrote it anyway, pencil tentative. Yet the clue returned to me later as I thought of the women who had passed in Eleanor's life, remembered briefly, almost reluctantly, like names on the edges of fading paper. My deduction, if it could be called such, was that Eleanor's death was not the solitary event the doctor had declared, nor the trivial notice the Oxford Mail had printed. It was a death framed by women in passing, by half-seen companions, and faintly recalled gestures by those who noticed what men often overlook. The Constable Chandler called upon me that night, bringing with him a copy of the coroner's preliminary note. Routine, unremarkable. But Chandler's unease had not subsided. He told me he had gone back to Holywell Street, unable to leave the matter alone, and had spoken with another tenant, a student's widow herself, who recalled hearing a woman's voice in Eleanor's room the week before she died. She could not hear the words, only the rise and fall, but she was sure it was not Eleanor speaking alone. I asked if she recognized the voice. She did not. Only that it was calm, deliberate, and ended abruptly, as if cut off before its conclusion. So now there were 2 visitors, the man with the marbled book, and the unnamed woman with her parcel and her tightly wound scarf. Both entered Eleanor's narrowing orbit in the months before her death, both departing without leaving the faintest trace beyond the recollections of those who observed in passing. I poured another measure that night and sat long by the window, the rain returning to polish the stones outside into dull mirrors. Oxford, I thought, is a city built not upon certainty, but upon recollections of who saw whom, who whispered what, who passed by. lives interlaced not by declarations, but by glimpses. Eleanor's life had dwindled into such glimpses, and it was through them alone that I could begin to understand her final days. A woman glimpsed at tea, a woman overheard me in conversation, a woman who remembered briefly. Women in passing, yes, but sometimes it is those who pass lightly across the stage who carry the heaviest shadows. I thought again of the crossword. 4 letters, a woman remembered briefly, perhaps not a name after all, perhaps Alma Soul, or Echo, the faint voice of memory. None quite fit, and so I left the square blank, unfinished. Some clues resist completion, and perhaps they are truest when they remain so. And so Eleanor Whitcomb receded further into silence, accompanied not by proclamations but by fragments carried to me by women in passing. Pieces of her life folded, glimpsed, and left waiting like the untouched glass by her chair. I have often found that truth creeps toward one not in the form of documents or declarations, but in the repetition of small rituals. And for me, the ritual was the pint, bitter amber, carrying its own silence. I took it again that evening, in a pub near Cormarket, where the windows steamed against the drizzle outside and where voices folded together in low, indistinct murmurs. The pint again, yes, but with it the faint recognition that repetition itself is a form of memory. The glass was cool in my hand, the condensation beading like punctuation. I watched it as though the liquid inside might clarify the fog that still hung over Eleanor Whitcomb's death. There had been the untouched glass in her room, the one I could not unsee, the one that lingered like a riddle. A glass waiting like mine now. And I could not help feeling that by lifting mine, I was intruding on her silence. I had come here not merely for habit, but because the landlady had told Chandler that Eleanor herself had once visited this place, though rarely. She would sit alone, order nothing stronger than half a shandy, and leave after no more than 20 minutes. The barman recalled her vaguely, a quiet woman, polite, the kind who never required attention. But one evening he remembered with certainty she had not been alone. He leaned across to me when he told it, lowering his voice as though to prevent the memory from leaking. A man had joined her, not elderly, not young, with a coat too heavy for the weather. They had spoken briefly, quietly, and then she had left abruptly, the man remaining to finish his drink. What had unsettled the barman was not the conversation itself, for he heard little of it, but the man's habit of tracing a finger along the rim of his glass over and over as though sounding a note no one else could hear. I asked if he carried a book. The barman nodded slowly. Yes, he thought he had seen one resting on the chair beside him, bound in worn marbling. The pint again, I thought, echoing not only my own ritual, but Eleanor's, and now this stranger's. Each glass a marker, an object touched yet never emptied in the way one expects. I drank slowly, letting the bitterness rest on my tongue, and felt the room recede. The pub was crowded, but I heard only fragments, a laugh too loud, a complaint about bus routes, the clatter of coins upon wood. And in the midst of it all, my thoughts rearranged themselves as methodically as letters in a crossword. A woman leaves her glass untouched. A man finishes his, but spends more time tracing its rim than drinking. A habit or a signal? The deduction was not a certainty, but a suggestion. 2 glasses, both significant by what they withheld rather than what they offered. I left the pub and stepped into the night, where the rain had thinned into a fine mist. Oxford streets glistened, every lamp haloed in damp air. I walked without direction, following instinct more than purpose, until I found myself again before the gates of St. Saviour's. The shadow of the tower stretched across the cobbles, dark against the faint gleam of wet stone. I recalled the Don who had spoken of Eleanor's husband with hurried respect, the librarian who had murmured of a scandal unnamed. The college seemed to shrink from scrutiny, retreating into its own cloistered silence. Yet silence, like an untouched glass, is never neutral. Back at my room, the crossword waited. 6, down, again in repetition, 4 letters. The answer leapt at me once, simple, obvious, almost mocking. Yet as I wrote it, I thought of the pint again, the glass again, the silence again. Once is never only once. Once repeated ritual pattern. I set down my pencil and poured a final measure from the bottle. The whiskey caught the lamplight, amber, like the pint, amber, like memory. I thought of Eleanor sitting in that same pub, quiet, measured, waiting perhaps for a man with a marbled book who would not stay long. The pint again, hers unfinished, his obsessive, mine habitual, each carrying not refreshment but resonance, each leaving behind not clarity but residue. And so I sat in the half-light, the city muffled by rain, the taste of bitterness still on my tongue, and knew only this repetition is its own form of confession. Somewhere in the ritual of the pint lay the pattern I sought, but it was a pattern that, like the crossword, would not reveal itself fully until another square was filled. It was Chandler, as it so often was in those days, who mentioned the choir. He had gone, out of restlessness rather than duty, to an evensong service at St. Saviour's. He told me later, with a kind of embarrassed awe, that the voices had lifted him out of himself, but it was not the music that mattered. It was the glances, and glances, I reminded him, are the truest instruments in Oxford. I went the following evening. Rain slicked the stones outside, and the chapel glowed faintly within, its candles quivering like hesitant thoughts. The choir filed in, gowns whispering against wood, and the first notes rose upward to the beams, Latin psalms rendered not as prayer, but as discipline. I listened, yes, but more to the silences between verses, the rustle of movement, the faint coughs that betray nerves. From the back row I saw her, a woman seated apart, her scarf drawn tight again at the throat. Chandler had described such a figure in passing. She followed the service with precision, yet her eyes strayed more often to the side chapel than to the lectern. I wondered who or what she was watching. The Don who had spoken with me days earlier was present as well, his head inclined not toward the prayers, but toward the floor, as though weighed by something unsaid. When the choir reached the Magnificat, I saw his hand tremble faintly as he turned the page of his service book, a detail so small it might have been nothing, but in Oxford, nothing is ever only nothing. Afterwards, outside under the dripping eaves, I asked Chandler what he had noticed. He said only this, that during the final hymn the woman with the scarf had mouthed no words at all, though her book was open, a gesture of participation without belief. I reminded him that such gestures, repeated, often conceal more than they reveal. Back in my room I poured the inevitable glass and turned again to the crossword. The clue read, voice without conviction, 5 letters. I tried tenor, then bass, neither fitting. Finally I wrote about drones, a sound present, but emptied of faith. It seemed too apt to be a coincidence. What remained with me from the service was not the music, nor even the woman, but the sense of surveillance. A choir sings outward, toward congregation and heaven alike, yet that night it felt inward, as though every note were measuring the silences of those present. I could not shake the thought that Eleanor herself had once sat here, perhaps beside her husband before the war, listening to the same psalms, watching the same shadows collect beneath the arches. I recalled the letter on her desk, I shall come as promised. Could the promise have been linked to the college chapel? A meeting after service, perhaps, disguised in the anonymity of worship. The man with the marbled book had come to her room, yes, but had he first sought her in this place, where silence could pass as devotion? I left St. Saviour's unsettled, the notes of the choir still hanging in the misty air. On the cobbles outside, I noticed something small, almost ridiculous, a hymn sheet, folded and abandoned, soaked through by the rain. I bent to pick it up. The ink had bled, words lost into blur, yet one remained legible. Wait. A single word, stubborn against the elements. I slipped the paper into my coat, not for evidence, but because such fragments cling to me, as clues do when they are not yet understood. That night I thought again of the untouched glass on Eleanor's table, of the stranger's finger tracing his pint, of the woman with the scarf who mouthed no words. Repetition, ritual, gesture, these were the choir in which suspicion sang. Each silent act has its own verse, each absence its own music. And so, in the half-light of my room, with the crossword half completed and the whiskey dwindling, I understood only this: suspicion is rarely loud. It is quiet, sung under the breath, hidden in choirs, folded in hymn sheets. And it was there, in the susurrus of women and men pretending at faith, that Eleanor's death began to echo most clearly. The choir dispersed, but the suspicions remained. It was inevitable, I suppose, that someone would mention the will. In Oxford, money lies beneath stone just as surely as damp does, spreading invisibly until the surface buckles. It was the landlady at Holywell Street who first brought it to me, in a voice edged with pride that she had something to contribute. Mrs. Whitcomb had, she said, spoken more than once of putting her affairs in order. There had been papers, envelopes, sealed and resealed, whispers of solicitors' names. The landlady, of course, had never seen the documents, but rumours, once seeded, grow quickly in narrow stairwells. A fellow tenant claimed Eleanor had intended to leave what little she had to a charitable trust connected with the college. Another insisted she had spoken of a niece in Dorset, long estranged but perhaps reconciled at the end. Each voice contradicted the next, as though truth were merely a choice of gossip. I visited the solicitor whose name had surfaced most consistently, a Mr. Halbrook, whose office perched above a chemist's near Beaumont Street. The room smelled of polish and damp, and Halbrook himself resembled his ledger thin, dry, reluctant to yield more than a line at a time. Yes, he confirmed, Mrs. Whitcomb had indeed drafted a will. It had been revised twice in recent years, each time in haste, each time with a change of beneficiaries. At last count, she had left the bulk of her modest estate, scarcely more than her lodgings and some investments, to the college itself. He produced no details beyond this, citing confidentiality, but his eyes betrayed a weariness that suggested disputes had been anticipated. I asked who else knew of the revisions. He admitted that a clerk, long since departed, might have spoken out of turn. Oxford thrives on loose tongues. I walked back through the rain-soaked streets with the thought that the will, though ordinary on paper, might yet explain the stranger's visit. A man carrying a book could as easily carry resentment. Beneficiaries shift, expectations sour. The possibility was too neat, and neatness in such matters is rarely trustworthy. That evening Chandler brought me word that another tenant had remembered Eleanor speaking, not long before her death, of wanting the college choir to sing at her funeral. He reported this with the seriousness of a man uncovering state secrets. I thanked him, but inwardly dismissed it as more embroidery. Wishes are not clues, I reminded myself. And yet, as I sat with my glass, I unfolded the crossword. The clue was 9 across inheritance that misleads 8 letters. The answer was obvious red herring. I wrote it slowly, pencil pressing harder than usual, and allowed myself the smallest smile at the irony. A will, an inheritance, and suspicion. Too perfect, too precise. Still, red herrings serve a purpose. They test the patience of the solver. And I could not wholly dismiss the thought that Eleanor's shifting intentions might have left someone unmoored. A son estranged, a niece forgotten, a college greedy for bequests. Each possibility dangled like bait. What troubled me more than the money was the timing. Why should she have left her glass untouched on the very evening, perhaps the very hour, she expected a visitor? A woman intent on securing her affairs might toast her resolve, not abandon it. I thought again of her photographs turned face down. It was not avarice I saw in that gesture, but shame. I returned once more to Halbrook, pressing him further. He sighed, and in that sigh confessed what his profession forbade him to state plainly. Eleanor had spoken not of generosity but of obligation. The college, she said, had been her husband's world, and she owed it something she could never otherwise repay. Her son, yes, had been excluded, deliberately, after his abrupt departure. Holbrook's lips tightened as he said this, as though even the telling tasted bitter. So the will existed, yes, and it could explain anger, resentment, motives whispered in stairwells. But in my heart I felt its irrelevance. The will was not the untouched glass, not the marbled book, not the hymn sheet blurred with rain. It was a diversion, and I felt it as surely as I felt the damp in my bones. I left the office and walked toward Jericho, the drizzle turning to mist. On Walton Street, the lamps glowed through it faintly, smudged halos of yellow. I entered another public house, not for information but for warmth, and ordered the pint again. It tasted of routine more than refreshment, and I watched the condensation form and vanish as it had before. A man at the next table traced a finger along his glass absent-mindedly, and I flinched inwardly at the repetition. Patterns, I thought, always patterns. If the will were truly decisive, it would explain everything too easily. But Eleanor's life had not been easy, nor her death. The truth, I suspected, lay not in documents above chemists' shops, but in silent silences, in choirs, in tea rooms, in glasses left waiting. I drained my pint and returned to my rooms where the crossword waited, its red herring already caught. And I knew with that dull certainty that comes rarely but insistently that the will was only a shadow cast to distract from the deeper shape. A red herring, yes, but even herrings leave a scent in the water. The word arrived one damp afternoon, whispered with the relish of those who treasure scandal more than fact. An affair, they said. Eleanor had been involved in one years ago with a man tied to the college. Some claimed it had been a fellow, others a visiting scholar, still others a cleric, whose sermons had once drawn half of Oxford. The names shifted depending on the teller, but the story held its shape as a liaison, discreet yet known, and perhaps never forgiven. I listened, outwardly patient, inwardly weary. In Oxford, rumour is the coin of the realm, and affairs are its most common currency. They rise and fall like candle smoke, leaving behind only the faintest stain. Still, I could not ignore it. A life turned face down in photographs, a son estranged, a widow living on half-loaves and ink-stained handkerchiefs. Such a life often hides the shadow of love misplaced. Chandler, eager as always, took the suggestion with solemn gravity. He said he had spoken with a verger at St. Saviour's who remembered Eleanor visiting the chapel late at night when the doors should have been locked. She had been seen standing by the choir stalls whispering to a man in clerical collar. The verger had not intruded. Oxford teaches discretion, or perhaps cowardice. I traced the tale further to an elderly librarian who recalled lending Eleanor volumes of poetry by Donna, Hardy, Christina Rossetti, and noted that she always returned them with bookmarks pressed between verses on love and betrayal. The librarian smiled faintly as she recounted it, as though remembering her own youth, but when I asked about the man, she hesitated. "Perhaps a fellow," she said at last, but the details blurred. Memory, like ink, runs in the rain. I thought again of the stranger with the marbled book. Could it have been a volume of verse, a relic of an affair, never buried? The notion was too pleasing, too tidy. Still, in matters of the heart, even the untidiest threads cling longest. That evening I poured my glass and studied the crossword. 14 across old flame returns, 6 letters. I toyed with reminding, then affair, before writing simply ex-love. It fit, but the answer looked awkward, ungainly on the page, as awkward as the rumours themselves. Perhaps that was fitting. In truth, I did not believe Eleanor's death had been shaped by passion, not in the crude sense of adultery and scandal. Her life, as I had pieced it, was defined more by restraint than indulgence. The apple counted out, the half-shandy sipped, the photographs hidden. If she had once allowed herself an affair, I imagined it had ended in silence rather than explosion. Still, I could not dismiss the possibility that another had remembered it differently. A lover spurned, a son shamed, a husband betrayed, each might carry the memory like a stone in the pocket, heavy, unshakable. The woman with the scarf, the man with the book, could have been tethered to this past, drawn back to Eleanor's room, not by present grievance, but by the embers of old desire. I walked that night through the rain-darkened lanes toward Christ Church meadow, the paths glistening beneath the lamps. Lovers once had walked here, hand in hand, their whispers carried by the river's hush. I thought of Eleanor and her imagined companion, their steps echoing between stone walls, their laughter, if there had been laughter, swallowed by Oxford's endless appetite for secrets. The affair, if it had existed, was now no more than a red herring. I felt it as strongly as I had felt the will's irrelevance. Too pat, too expected. But like herrings, affairs leave their scent. And I could not dismiss entirely that in Eleanor's final days, someone had sought to remind her of what had once been risked or lost. Back in my room, I set down my pencil and stared at the half-finished crossword, Old Flame Returns. I erased the ex-love, the letters smudging faintly. Perhaps the answer was more elusive. Ember, maybe. Something that glows faintly long after the fire has died. Yes, ember. It fit, and it satisfied, for it spoke not of passion still burning, but of memory, stubborn and faint, waiting in the dark. Eleanor's death was no inferno of betrayal. It was, at most, the cooling ember of an old flame. A red herring, perhaps, but herrings, embers, glasses, left waiting, each carried its own faint warmth, its own faint smoke. And so I poured another measure, the whiskey catching the lamplight like fire subdued, and thought of Eleanor's life. A will that shifted, an affair that may have been. Both red herrings, yes, yet both leave traces, as all untruths do. And I felt, with that quiet certainty that belongs less to deduction than to intuition, that the truth lay elsewhere, waiting still in the silence. It is a curious thing how often life itself arranges its mysteries upon the grid of a crossword. I have long trusted those black and white squares more than most reports that find their way across my desk. They demand precision, yet invite misdirection. They require patience, yet reward intuition. It was to the crossword I turned that night, the case spread before me in fragments too discordant to reconcile. The room was dim, the lamp pooling its yellow light across the page. Outside, the rain tapped faintly against the glass as though rehearsing a rhythm it had long forgotten. I stared at the half-completed puzzle, the pencil resting between my fingers, and thought again of Eleanor Whitcomb, her untouched glass. She turned photographs, her visitors who left no name. The clue that caught me was 17, down past remembered in silence. 7 letters. I tried memory, silence, history, but none would fit. The letters I already had, filled from other clues, were see-ho. Something lingered there, something half-formed. I wrote, echoing, then erased it. Perhaps it was school, the place where the past is both learned and endured. Still it resisted me, and resistance is always instructive. I let the pencil rest and allowed the case to rise again in my mind. Chandler had brought me whispers that afternoon, another tenant insisting Eleanor had burned papers in her grate a week before she died. Fragments of letters perhaps reduced to ash and smoke. The story seemed credible only in the way all rumours do when repeated often enough. But I thought of the crossword again and remembered it in silence. Burning is its own kind of silence. I considered the will, the supposed affair, the choir's unspoken glances. All red herrings, perhaps, or perhaps each a fragment of the larger design, as untrustworthy and yet as necessary as the misleading clue in a puzzle. A crossword without misdirection is no puzzle at all. It was then I noticed the smallest of details in my own notes. A slip of paper where I had scribbled the phrase that appeared in the letter on Eleanor's desk, "I shall come as promised." I had underlined a promise, absent-mindedly, and beside it I had drawn a small grid, 4 squares across. Beneath it I had written almost without thinking once, the word I had written in a crossword days earlier when the clue had been, again, in repetition. The pint again, the glass again, the silence again. Once repeated, it becomes a pattern. I stared at the word until its letters blurred, until it became not an answer, but a reminder. Eleanor had waited once, perhaps more than once, and always the promise had been unfulfilled. Back to the crossword. See-ho, it passed, remembered in silence. I saw it suddenly as if revealed not by logic, but by weariness, echoic. The word was unfamiliar, archaic even, but it fit. To be echoic is to recall the past by resonance, not by substance. Memory that is sound without voice. I wrote it in, the pencil marking the page with quiet insistence, and felt a shiver of recognition. Eleanor's death was echoic, not violent, not abrupt, but reverberation of old silences, the will, the affair, the strangers, each an echo of choices made long ago, still sounding faintly in the present. The deduction, if it could be called such, was less a solution than the sensation that Eleanor had died, not in the presence of strangers, but in the company of echoes. The glass left waiting, the hymn sheet blurred, the scarf wound tightly, the marbled book unopened. Each an object more symbolic than functional, each more silence than speech. I sat back and looked at the crossword, complete but unsatisfying, as all crosswords are when the answers reveal less than the questions. Still the clue lingered in the past, remembered in silence. I thought of Eleanor staring at her photographs turned face down. She had chosen silence over remembrance, and yet remembrance had returned to her nonetheless, carried by visitors who came briefly and left abruptly, leaving nothing but the disturbance of an echo. Later, long after midnight, I walked to the window and looked out upon the rain-darkened street. The lamps shone weakly through the mist, and I saw my own reflection superimposed upon the glass, faint, insubstantial, echoic. I lifted my glass and thought of hers, waiting still upon the table at Holywell Street, a parallel too deliberate to ignore, too heavy to dismiss. The crossword had given me no answer, not truly, but it has offered me a word, and words, when chosen with care, are often the first steps toward meaning. Echoic. That was Eleanor's death. An echo, unfinished, resonating in silence. And so I sat, the pencil laid down, the whiskey dwindling, the city hushed, and allowed the echoes to linger. Answers would come, or they would not. But for that night, it was enough to know that the crossword's clue had drawn me closer, not to solution, but to the heart of the silence. It came to me through the smallest of accidents, as so much in this case seemed to do. Chandler, rummaging with more enthusiasm than delicacy through Eleanor Whitcomb's desk, had dislodged a thin volume wedged behind the drawers. He brought it to me as though he had discovered a crown jewel. It was no jewel, of course, but a diary, the cover frayed and the clasp broken. Most of it was blank, the entries sparse, irregular, sometimes separated by months. Yet on one page there were words written with uncharacteristic pressure, the pen digging into paper as though trying to carve permanence out of fragility. I read it in the half-light of my room, the lamp haloed against the damp window pane. The entry was brief. "He will come," she had written. "He promised before, but this time he will. I must be ready." Nothing more. No date, no name, no explanation. But the repetition of promise, the insistence on readiness, chilled me. It echoed the letter found on her desk, the words, "I shall come as promised." A pattern of expectation, yet one that seemed always deferred. I turned the page and found faint indentations where words had once been written and later torn away. Someone had removed a page, perhaps several, carefully, but not without leaving their scars upon the paper beneath. I shaded the surface lightly with a pencil, hoping the grooves might yield their ghost. A few letters emerged, partial, fractured, like bones unearthed from shallow ground. One word suggested regret. Another, less certain, looked like a choir. Regret. Choir. A diary that spoke more in its absences than in its presence. I closed the book and sat back, the whiskey in my glass untouched. It was not the words themselves that disturbed me, but the gesture of erasure. To write is to declare. To tear out is to conceal. And concealment is always louder than confession. Later that evening, I walked once more to St. Saviour's. The chapel was empty, the air stale with candle wax and damp wood. I stood near the choir stalls, the word flickering in my mind. Choir. Eleanor had wished for the choir to sing at her funeral, Chandler had said, or so one tenant had insisted. Yet here, in the silence of the stalls, it felt less like wish than memory. I imagined her seated here, waiting for a visitor who never came, whispering promises into the echoes. The diary page returned to me as I left the chapel, its words like a faint refrain, "He will come." He promised before. This time he will. They were the words of someone who believed in repetition, who trusted that a deferred promise might still be fulfilled. But life, I knew, is less generous with its repetitions than crosswords are. Once is often all we are granted. Back in my room, I unfolded the day's crossword. The clue at 20, 2 across the record, kept secret, 5 letters. I wrote a diary almost without thought, the pencil tip pressing harder than usual, but I hesitated. Was the diary truly secret or merely private? The distinction mattered. A diary invites discovery, even as it pretends otherwise. Its very existence is a form of disclosure. The real secret was not in what Eleanor wrote, but in what she had chosen to remove. I thought again of the torn pages, the faint word regret. Whose regret? Her own, for promises believed, or another's, for promises broken? And the word choir, was it recollection of an affair whispered among hymns, or anticipation of a meeting arranged in sacred cover? The diary yielded neither. It yielded only silence, as all diaries eventually do. Chandler, when I spoke of it, suggested eagerly that we trace the handwriting of the missing pages, as though the absent could be conjured by forensic trickery. I told him no, what matters in such cases is not what is torn out, but why the tearing occurs at all. To destroy a page is to acknowledge its weight. Its absence is more eloquent than its presence. And yet I could not deny a small deduction. The visitor with the marbled book, the woman with the scarf, the whispered promises, all revolved around Eleanor's readiness. She had been preparing not for death, but for an encounter. Her glass, poured and left untouched, had not been poured for solitude. It had been poured for welcome. The diary page confirmed it. She had been waiting, certain that this time he would come. He had promised, and still she had died with her glass untouched, her photographs turned away, her diary incomplete. I finished my own glass at last and set it beside the crossword, the word diary etched across the squares like a confession too obvious to ignore. Outside, the bells tolled across the wet city, their notes heavy with damp. I thought of Eleanor waiting still, her life arranged like squares across a grid, some filled, some torn away, all unfinished. The diary page gave me no answers, only echoes. But in Oxford, echoes are often the only truth we are given. Confession, I have learned, is rarely loud. It does not come with trumpets or tears. More often it arrives in a whisper, or in the way someone avoids your eyes, or in the silence that spreads after a sentence that never quite reaches its end. It was such a confession I encountered in the dim corridors of St. Saviour's long after the chapel. Lamps had been extinguished. The Don, who had once spoken of Eleanor's husband with such unease, met me again, almost by accident. His gown hung limp upon him, the hem damp from the stones outside. He asked if I sought shelter from the rain, though his voice suggested he knew precisely why I was there. We walked together through the cloister, the sound of our steps amplifying against the stone, until at last he stopped beneath a narrow archway and said quite simply, "She waited too long." I did not press him. Words, when fragile, must be allowed to unfold at their own pace. He spoke haltingly of years past, of Eleanor's visits to the college after her husband's death, of a son who had left under disgrace, though the nature of the disgrace he would not reveal, of evenings when Eleanor had lingered in the chapel long after the last hymn, waiting for someone who had promised to come. Always promised, never arrived. The Don lowered his head as he spoke. I asked, gently, if he had ever been that man. He shook his head with a sadness that seemed genuine, not me. But I knew who, a fellow once, who left the college quietly. He promised her things he could not keep. She believed him until the end. It was as much confession as I would receive, and I knew it. Oxford excels at half-truths, at history wrapped in discretion, at sins buried beneath ivy and time. I left the Don to his silence and returned to my room with rain still clinging to my coat. On my desk lay the crossword, unfinished, from the night before. 24, down admission without sound, 10 letters. I smiled faintly at the coincidence and wrote a confession. The word fit perfectly neatly, as though the puzzle itself had anticipated the Don's whisper. Yet I hesitated. Was it truly confession or only memory disguised as one? I poured a glass and thought again of Eleanor. Her untouched whiskey, her diary page, her letter promised that someone would come. She had lived her final days in expectation, as though a single meeting might untangle the knots of a lifetime. But expectation is not confession. Expectation demands, confession releases. I thought too of the woman with the scarf, the one who mouthed no words in the choir. Chandler believed she was complicit, that she had been the visitor, perhaps even the cause. I was less certain. Her silence struck me not as guilt, but as fear. She had been present, yes, but presence is not always responsibility. Sometimes it is only a witness. The quiet confession, I realized, had not been Eleanor's. It belonged to those around her, the Don who spoke in whispers, the librarian who remembered her choice of poetry, the barman who recalled her unfinished pint. Each in their own way confessed to having seen her, known her, and yet done nothing. Oxford had conspired in its passivity, and passivity, too, is a form of guilt. I set down my glass and returned to the crossword. Confession. The word gleamed back at me, stark in its certainty. Yet certainty, as always, eluded me. Eleanor's death remained incomplete, her glass still waiting, her diary still torn. But perhaps that was the truest confession of all, that life ends not with explanation, but with silence. Near midnight I walked once more to Holywell Street. The lodging house loomed tired against the mist. I stood before the window where she had once sat, imagining her folded hands, her patient eyes, her untouched glass. I whispered aloud the word confession, and it seemed to echo faintly against the damp stone, as though she had heard and understood. No one else passed. The street was hushed, save for the rain tapping like fingers upon slate. I remained there a long while, not in expectation, not in demand, but in acknowledgement. Eleanor's confession was never written, never spoken. It resided only in the objects she left: the glass, the diary, the letter, and in those who remembered her too late. When at last I returned to my rooms, I finished the crossword. Every square filled, every clue resolved. Yet the satisfaction was hollow, for the puzzle of her life remained uncompleted. I drank the final measure from my glass and set it down carefully, this time ensuring it would not be moved. The quiet confession lingered, not in words, but in silence. And perhaps that is all confession ever is: silence recognized at last for what it means. It ended, as so many things in Oxford do, not with revelation, but with quiet resignation. I found myself once again in the pub near Cormarket, the one where Eleanor had once sat with her visitor. The windows were misted against the cold evening, the air thick with the familiar smell of hops and damp coats, the clatter of coins, the drone of casual voices, the occasional burst of laughter, all of it carried on indifferent to the weight that pressed upon me. I ordered the pint, though with less appetite than ritual. It was set before me, amber beneath the froth, the glass already slick with condensation. I did not lift it. I only watched, remembering hers on the small table, by the window in Holywell Street, the whisky left half full, waiting. The pint remained untouched, as though it belonged more to her than to me. Chandler had grown quiet by this point in our inquiries. The red herrings had exhausted him, the will, the affair, the whispers of scandal. He still insisted that somewhere within them lay the truth, but his insistence had thinned into uncertainty. He sat across from me that night, shifting the glass in front of him nervously, tracing its rim in an unconscious imitation of the stranger. When I pointed it out, he flushed and withdrew his hand. I told him it was a common gesture, meaningless perhaps, but in Oxford even meaningless gestures gather weight. I thought again of Eleanor's diary, the torn page, the words regret and choir faintly imprinted upon the paper beneath. Regret, yes, there had been much of that. A son estranged, a life, measured in halves and fragments. Choir, the service where a woman with a scarf mouthed no words, where glances passed like shadows across the stalls. But these were not conclusions. They were echoes, reverberations of a past never confessed. The crossword that evening offered another provocation. 19 across, left unfinished, 7 letters. The answer was obviously incomplete. I filled it in slowly, the pencil marking each square with deliberate weight. It was a word that belonged not only to the puzzle, but to the case itself. Eleanor's life, her glass, her diary, her waiting are all incomplete. And her death, too, offered no completion, only silence. I had expected, foolishly perhaps, that there would come a moment of clarity, that the visitor with the marbled book, the woman with the scarf, the will, the affair, would resolve into a single line of truth. But the truth, if it existed, remained withheld. What I had instead were fragments, each carrying its own faint meaning but refusing to align. The Don's words returned to me. She waited too long, perhaps that was all there was to know. Eleanor had waited for promises never kept, for visitors who came and went without explanation, for a son who never returned. She had lived in expectation, and expectation itself had become her undoing. The glass by her chair was less evidence than epitaph. Chandler asked me that night if I believed she had been murdered. I could not answer him directly. Murder implies intention, action, violence. Eleanor's death seemed more like a surrender, assisted perhaps by neglect, by silence, by the weight of promises broken. If someone had hastened it, they had done so not with poison or force, but with absence, and absence is not easily charged in a court of law. I left the pub with the pint still full upon the table. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the cobbles glistening beneath the lamps. The city lay hushed, its stones dark with centuries of secrets. I walked without direction, only with the sense that the case, if such it was, had reached its conclusion not in discovery, but in acknowledgement. Back in my room, I set the unfinished crossword beside me and poured a measure from the bottle. The word incomplete stared up from the grid, implacable. I drank slowly, not to finish, but to mark the moment, and thought again of Eleanor's waiting. She had poured her glass in readiness for someone who never arrived. I had ordered mine in ritual, knowing already it would remain untouched. Perhaps that is the only conclusion I could offer that lives often end not with explanation, but with what is left behind. A diary torn, a hymn sheet blurred, a glass unfinished. Each fragment is an echo, incomplete, yet eloquent in its silence. The bells of Oxford tolled midnight, their notes reverberating through the damp air. I set down my glass, the whiskey half drunk, and looked once more at the crossword. Confession. Echoic, incomplete, words that belonged as much to Eleanor's story as to the puzzle. Words that would remain long after I had closed the book. And so the pint remained untouched, waiting still, its silence more telling than any declaration. Some mysteries end not with solution, but with silence accepted at last.